Before we begin today's story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt a presence in an empty room? That inexplicable sensation that someone is watching you, even when you're completely alone. If you're watching from somewhere in Appalachia, you might understand better than most. These mountains hold secrets, whispers that echo through generations like wind through hollow trees. Today we're traveling to Casey County, Kentucky, where one of Appalachia's most disturbing mysteries unfolded, a story about an ordinary bed that became the vessel for something not quite at rest. I've spent months researching this case, tracking down family records, interviewing descendants, and visiting the locations where these events took place. What I discovered will make you question everything you believe about the line between this world and whatever lies beyond it. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And have you ever encountered something you couldn't explain? Something that lingered in the corners of your vision or woke you in the dead of night with the certainty that you weren't alone? Our story begins on a crisp autumn morning in 1879, when Mary Lee Gadbury drew her first breath in a one-room cabin in Casey County. The mist hung low over the hills that day, shrouding the hollers in a pearly haze, as her parents welcomed their firstborn daughter into a world of hardship and beauty. The cabin where Mary Lee was born stood on a gentle slope overlooking Paw Paw Creek, a modest structure built by her father's hands from logs hewn from the surrounding forest. The chinking between the logs was uneven, allowing thin blades of sunlight to penetrate the dim interior, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air above the newborn's face. Her mother, exhausted from the long labor but radiant with relief, cradled the infant to her breast while her father looked on with quiet pride. For a brief suspended moment, the family existed in perfect harmony, the endless work of survival temporarily forgotten as they studied the delicate features of their daughter's face. Casey County wasn't much to speak of back then, just scattered homesteads carved into the wilderness, each family surviving by their own hands and the occasional mercy of neighbors. The nearest proper town, Somerset, was nearly 40 miles away, a journey that could take a full week by wagon over rutted trails that turned to sucking mud in spring and froze into treacherous ridges during winter. The distance meant that Casey County families lived in near complete isolation, particularly during the harsh winter months when snow made the mountain passes impassable. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, built their own furniture, and treated their own ailments with herbs and folk remedies passed down through generations. The Gadburys lived simply, like everyone else in these parts. Their cabin was sparsely furnished, a hand-built table surrounded by three-legged stools, a rope bed covered with handmade quilts in one corner, a rocking chair positioned by the stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The floor was packed earth, swept clean each morning with a broom made of bound twigs. Their possessions were few but precious: a family Bible with births and deaths recorded in fading ink, a cast-iron skillet passed down from mother to daughter, a quilt pieced together from scraps of wedding dresses and baby clothes, each square containing its own story, its own memory. Mary Lee grew up understanding the rhythm of mountain life, how each season demanded its own particular labor, how every possession carried the weight of sacrifice, how isolation shaped a person's mind into something altogether different from city folk. Spring meant planting, summer meant tending, fall meant harvesting, and winter meant surviving. There was no rest, no reprieve from the constant work of existence. By the time she was 8, Mary Lee was responsible for minding her younger siblings, collecting eggs, and helping her mother with the washing, cooking, and cleaning. By 12, she could cook a full meal, mend clothes, tend to livestock, and help deliver a neighbor's baby if called upon. The Gadbury children attended school when they could be spared from farm work, which wasn't often. The schoolhouse was a 4-mile walk over ridge and hollow, and many days Mary Lee and her siblings arrived with mud-caked boots and wind-chapped faces, only to sit shivering in the drafty building as they struggled to concentrate on their lessons. Mary Lee learned to read and write, to cipher basic sums, and to recite portions of the Bible from memory. But her real education took place at home, learning which plants could heal and which could kill, how to read the weather in the shape of clouds and the behavior of animals, how to preserve food for the lean months, how to bring new life into the world, and how to prepare the dead for burial. She was practical and grounded, with no time for flights of fancy. The only indulgence she allowed herself was to sometimes wander down to Paw Paw Creek at dusk, watching how the fading light turned the water to liquid gold before darkness claimed it completely. During these rare moments of solitude, Mary Lee would allow herself to dream of a different life, not one of luxury or ease, for such concepts were beyond her imagination, but perhaps a life with a little more beauty, a little more tenderness than the one she knew. In those days, the Gadbury home was a place of orderly routine. Mary Lee's father worked from sunup to sundown, tending crops and the small apple orchard that provided most of their cash income. He was a tall, lean man with calloused hands and sun-creased eyes, a man of few words but deep conviction. When he spoke, everyone listened, not out of fear, but respect for the measured wisdom of his pronouncements. He seldom displayed affection openly, but his love for his family showed in the way he carried the youngest child on his shoulders during the long walk to church, or how he carved small wooden animals for each of his children during the quiet winter evenings. Mary Lee's mother managed the household with quiet efficiency, now with 3 children underfoot. She rose before dawn each day to kindle the fire and start the day's bread, working steadily until well after the children were asleep. Her hands were never still, kneading dough, mending clothes, carding wool, stirring stew, rocking a feverish child. She taught Mary Lee the skills she would need to run her own household someday, her instructions delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone, whether she was explaining how to render lard or how to lay out a corpse. They weren't demonstrative people, mountain folk rarely were, but there was unspoken affection in the way her father would bring home little treasures from his rare trips to Somerset, or how her mother would save the tenderest portions of meat for the children's plates. Love was expressed through service, through sacrifice, through the daily work of keeping each other alive and as comfortable as circumstances allowed. But even in this seemingly transparent existence, there were silences that spoke volumes. Nights when her parents would fall into hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when Mary Lee entered the room. The way certain names were never mentioned, certain paths never taken on their property. How her mother would sometimes stare toward the eastern ridge with a faraway look that Mary Lee couldn't decipher. The Gadburys, like most families in these hills, had their secrets, histories that weren't recorded in any county ledger, stories that weren't shared at church socials. There was the matter of her father's brother, whose name was spoken only in whispers, and whose grave lay unmarked on the far edge of the property. There were the letters that arrived twice yearly from somewhere in Ohio, letters that her mother read in private and then burned in the fireplace. There was the locked wooden box that her father kept beneath the floorboards, a box that Mary Lee had glimpsed only once, when he thought no one was watching, its contents a mystery that piqued her curiosity, but which she dared not inquire about. Mary Lee learned early that some questions weren't meant to be asked, some doors weren't meant to be opened. This was the unspoken law of mountain life. What happened behind closed doors stayed there, buried as surely as the dead in the family plots that dotted the hillsides. Privacy wasn't a luxury in the crowded confines of a one-room cabin. It was a state of mind, a mutual agreement to look away, to pretend not to hear, to never speak of certain things. Survival depended not just on physical labor, but on the psychological fortitude to contain one's thoughts, to suppress one's curiosity, to respect the boundaries between what could be acknowledged and what must remain hidden. And Mary Lee might have continued in this life indefinitely, eventually marrying a local boy and starting her own cycle of silent endurance, if not for the arrival that disrupted everything. She might have become the wife of the blacksmith's son or the miller's nephew, someone known to her family, someone predictable and safe. She might have lived out her days within sight of her childhood home, raising a brood of children who would never venture beyond the county line, never question the limitations of their existence. She might have grown old surrounded by the familiar, the same hills, the same faces, the same unspoken rules that had governed her parents' lives and their parents before them. But spring of 1891 brought more than just new growth to Casey County. It brought Eli Murphy, a stranger whose appearance caused ripples through the close-knit community. Word of his arrival spread through the hollers faster than spring floodwaters, carried from farm to farm by children sent on errands, by women gathering for quilting bees, by men meeting at the general store to trade news along with goods. A stranger was noteworthy enough, but a handsome stranger, that was cause for speculation, for curiosity, for cautious excitement in a place where novelty was as rare as leisure. Eli wasn't like the local men, who were weathered and worn by generations of hard mountain living, their bodies bent to the shape of their labor, their faces as familiar to each other as the contours of the surrounding hills. He carried himself differently, with a confidence that bordered on defiance, as if he answered to no one but himself. His clothes, though worn and practical, had a city cut to them, marking him immediately as an outsider. He had come to work as a lumberjack for the timber company that was gradually making its way through the county's virgin forests, felling ancient trees that had stood since before white settlement, transforming the landscape in ways both visible and invisible. Even that choice of profession set him apart. Most men in these parts were farmers first, and everything else second. A farmer was tied to his land, rooted to place by necessity and tradition. A lumberjack followed the timber, moving from camp to camp as the forests receded before the bite of axe and saw. Lumberjacks were transient by nature, here today and gone tomorrow, with no stake in the community beyond their temporary employment. They were viewed with a mixture of wariness and grudging respect, needed for their labor, but never fully trusted, never fully welcomed into the circle of belonging that defined mountain society. Eli's looks became the subject of hushed conversations after Sunday services, as women gathered in clusters while men loaded families into wagons for the journey home. He had inherited his mother's distinctive features, jet-black hair and almond-shaped eyes that hinted at her native ancestry that traced back to Pocahontas herself, or so the story went. His skin was darker than the ruddy complexion common to the Scots-Irish settlers who populated most of Casey County, giving him an exotic appearance that drew second glances from young women and suspicious stares from their fathers. But there was something else about Eli that drew people's attention, particularly the young women of marriageable age. Perhaps it was the hint of danger that clung to him like wood smoke, the suggestion of experiences beyond the narrow confines of mountain life. Perhaps it was the way he moved with animal grace, each motion deliberate and economical, nothing wasted. Or perhaps it was simply the novelty of his presence, a new face among the familiar, a blank page onto which hopes and fantasies could be projected. Everyone knew he had been in trouble with the law, though nobody could say exactly what for. Rumors circulated that he had killed a man in a barroom brawl in Clay County, that he had stolen horses in Virginia, that he had a wife in Tennessee whom he had abandoned. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling, but Eli neither confirmed nor denied them, letting the speculation swirl around him like mist on the mountainside, impenetrable and ephemeral. What was known for certain was that he had grown up hard after his mother died of fever one bitter winter, leaving behind 5 children and a husband, ill-equipped to raise them alone. His father, overcome by grief or simply unwilling to shoulder the burden, had abandoned the family to start anew with a woman who had no interest in raising another woman's children. The older Murphy children had been parceled out to relatives, but Eli, at 12, had refused to be given away like surplus livestock. He had walked away from his uncle's farm after just one night, choosing instead to make his own way in a world that had already taught him the harshest of lessons, that love was impermanent, that security was an illusion, that survival depended on self-reliance above all. He had survived by his wits and his will, taking work where he could find it, in coal mines despite his youth, on farms during harvest season, in timber camps when the logging companies pushed deeper into the mountains. He had slept in barns and under stars, had gone hungry more often than not, had learned to fight when necessary and to disappear when fighting wasn't an option. By the time he arrived in Casey County at 24, Eli had lived more life than most men twice his age, and the experience showed in his eyes, dark, watchful, giving nothing away while missing nothing. Mary Lee first saw Eli at a barn raising on a neighboring property. She was 13 then, helping the women prepare the midday meal for the working men, her hands busy with the familiar tasks of rolling biscuit dough and stirring the beans that had been simmering since dawn. The day was unusually warm for spring, and the open-sided cooking shelter offered little relief from the heat. Mary Lee's calico dress clung damply to her back as she worked, her face flushed from the cooking fires and the exertion. When Eli appeared in the doorway, sweat-soaked and sawdust-covered, asking for water, the conversation among the women faltered momentarily, then resumed at a higher pitch, like birds disturbed from their perch. Mary Lee, being nearest to the water bucket, dipped the communal ladle and turned to offer it to the stranger. She felt something shift inside her, a recognition of sorts, though of what she couldn't have said. Their eyes met briefly as she handed him the dipper, and in that moment something passed between them that made her both frightened and exhilarated. Eli's gaze lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary, taking in her features with an intensity that made her acutely aware of herself in a way she had never been before. She felt exposed, as if he could see beyond her outward appearance to something essential within her, something she herself couldn't name. Then he nodded his thanks, returned the ladle, and was gone, leaving Mary Lee with a strange hollowness in the pit of her stomach, as if she had missed a step while climbing familiar stairs. That night, lying in the darkness of the loft she shared with her siblings, Mary Lee replayed the encounter in her mind, examining it from every angle like a strange object found in the woods. What had passed between them? Why did her heart race at the memory of his eyes on hers? Why did she feel as if something momentous had occurred when nothing had really happened at all? She had no framework for understanding these feelings, no older sister to confide in, no mother who would welcome such confidences. So she tucked the experience away like a pressed flower between the pages of a book, something to be taken out and examined in private moments. In the months that followed, Mary Lee found herself crossing paths with Eli more frequently than on coincidence could explain. Perhaps he was deliberately placing himself in her way, or perhaps she was unconsciously seeking him out. He appeared at the general store when she was sent to trade eggs for sugar, at the creek when she went to wash clothes, at the edge of the orchard when she was gathering fallen apples. Each encounter was brief, marked by few words, but charged with unspoken communication, a lingering glance, a half-smile, a hand offered to help her over a fallen log, withdrawn as soon as she was steady. Slowly, Mary Lee began to learn fragments of Eli's story, pieced together from these brief exchanges and from the gossip that continued to circulate about him. She learned about his mother, America, whose beauty was still spoken of with a mixture of admiration and suspicion by the older women in the community. She learned about his childhood in Clay County, about the siblings he had lost touch with, about the various trades he had practiced in his wandering years. Each piece of information was a thread connecting her to him, weaving a web of understanding that transcended their limited verbal communication. By the time Mary Lee turned 14, the two had formed a connection that didn't require words, a shared glance across the churchyard, a brush of hands during community gatherings, a private joke that made her smile despite herself. They existed in a space between friendship and courtship, undefined but undeniable. Mary Lee's parents noticed, of course. Nothing escaped notice in a community where everyone's business was everyone else's entertainment. Her father frowned when Eli's name was mentioned. Her mother's lips thinned to a worried line, but neither forbade the association outright. Perhaps they recognized the futility of opposition, or perhaps they saw practical advantages in the interest of a man who, despite his questionable background, was known to be a hard worker with savings put by. When Eli formally asked Mary Lee's father for her hand in marriage in 1893, nobody was particularly surprised. Girls married young in these parts. They had to if they wanted to see their children grow to adulthood, given how short life expectancies were. A woman of 18 was already considered past her prime, approaching spinsterhood with alarming speed. Mary Lee, at 14, was actually slightly older than some brides whose marriages were arranged almost as soon as they showed signs of womanhood. What did raise eyebrows was how Mary Lee's father agreed without the customary period of deliberation. Most fathers would make a show of considering such a request, would consult with male relatives, would perhaps set conditions or demand proofs of the suitor's ability to provide. The abrupt acceptance fueled speculation throughout the community. Some whispered that perhaps there was already a child on the way, though time would prove that gossip false. Others suggested more pragmatic reasons. The Gadburys had another 2 daughters to feed, and one less mouth at the table wouldn't hurt. The truth, known only to the family, was more complicated, involving debts and promises, old connections and new necessities, the intricate web of obligation and opportunity that governed life in these isolated communities. Whatever the reason, Mary Lee became Mrs. Eli Murphy before her 15th birthday, exchanging vows in a simple ceremony at the Baptist church where her family had worshipped for generations. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slighter frame, with a wreath of early spring flowers in her hair. Eli wore the only suit he owned, freshly brushed and mended, his dark hair slicked back with pomade borrowed from a fellow lumberjack. The congregation was sparse, the Gadbury family and a few close neighbors, a couple of Eli's workmates from the timber camp, the preacher and his wife. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering at the Gadbury cabin, with music provided by a cousin's fiddle and refreshments that had depleted the family's store of sugar and flour. By sundown, the newlyweds were alone in the tiny cabin Eli had built for them, facing the first night of their shared life with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. As was customary, Eli had built them a small cabin on her father's land, close enough for assistance if needed, but far enough for the privacy a young couple required. The site he had chosen was a small clearing near a spring where the ground leveled out before sloping down to Paw Paw Creek. He had selected each log himself, choosing straight trunks of chestnut and oak that would withstand decades of wind and weather. The cabin was simple but sturdy, a testament to Eli's skill as a woodworker. Just one room to start, with a fireplace along the eastern wall and windows that caught the morning light. The floor was puncheon, split logs laid flat side up, the rounded edges filled with clay to create a relatively smooth surface. The roof was cedar shakes, the chimney stone gathered from the creek bed, and mortared with clay mixed with horsehair for strength. Mary Lee took pride in making it a home, hanging curtains she had sewn herself from flour sacks bleached in the sun and dyed with walnut hulls to a warm brown. She arranged the few pieces of furniture they possessed with care, the table and chairs that had been her dowry, the trunk containing her clothing and linens, the shelves Eli had built to hold their dishes and cooking utensils. She swept the dirt yard clean of debris and planted flowers along the path to the door, marigolds and zinnias, whose bright blooms would welcome visitors and whose pungent scent would help keep insects at bay. Life settled into a new rhythm for the young couple. Eli worked long hours in the lumber camp, leaving before dawn and returning at dusk, his clothes saturated with the scent of fresh-cut wood and sweat. Mary Lee kept house, tended a small vegetable garden, and learned the intricacies of being a wife. She cooked meals from the ingredients she had grown herself or traded for with neighbors, washed clothes in the creek, and dried them on bushes to capture the fresh scent of sun and wind, preserved food for the winter months when fresh produce would be scarce. She also learned the more intimate aspects of marriage, navigating the unfamiliar territory of physical love with a mixture of shyness and curiosity. Eli was patient, more experienced, but careful not to overwhelm her, teaching her that pleasure could be mutual, that tenderness could exist in the most private of moments. In time, Mary Lee came to look forward to the nights, to the closeness that was possible only in darkness, to the feeling of being truly known by another person in ways that transcended words. They were happy in their way, though neither was given to outward displays of affection. Their love was expressed in more practical terms, Eli making sure the woodpile was always stocked before winter set in, Mary Lee having hot food ready no matter when he returned home. They worked side by side on Sundays, their one shared day of rest from regular labors, improving their home bit by bit, adding a lean-to for storage, digging a root cellar for preserving vegetables, clearing more land for an expanded garden. They talked as they worked, sharing stories from their childhoods, making plans for the future, gradually building the foundation of a shared life that went beyond the physical structure they inhabited. Within the first year of their marriage, Mary Lee gave birth to their first daughter, Maggie. The pregnancy had been relatively easy, with only the usual discomforts of swollen ankles and morning sickness that plagued women in her condition. The delivery, however, was another matter. Labor began unexpectedly one afternoon as Mary Lee was hanging laundry on the bushes behind the cabin. The pains came suddenly and with an intensity that took her by surprise, forcing her to her knees in the dirt yard. She managed to drag herself back into the cabin, where she labored alone for hours, Eli away at the timber camp with no way to be reached. A neighbor woman, stopping by to borrow a cup of sugar, heard Mary Lee's cries and summoned the local midwife, a stern-faced woman known for her skill, but not her bedside manner. By the time they arrived, Mary Lee was nearly delirious with pain and fear, certain she was dying, convinced that no woman could survive such agony. The midwife worked efficiently, positioning Mary Lee on the bed, administering herbal teas to strengthen contractions, applying lard to ease the baby's passage. Eli arrived just as Maggie made her entrance into the world, bursting through the door in a panic, having run the 3 miles from the lumber camp after receiving word of his wife's condition. The delivery was difficult but uncomplicated, and Mary Lee recovered quickly, as young mothers often did. Within days, she was up and about, carrying the infant as she went about her chores, learning to balance the demands of motherhood with the never-ending work of maintaining a household. Maggie was a good baby, seldom fussy, content to sleep in a cradle Eli had fashioned from a hollow log while Mary Lee worked nearby. Eli showed surprising tenderness toward his infant daughter, cradling her with hands roughened by axe handles and saw blades, his large fingers gentle as they traced the perfect curve of her cheek or the tiny whirls of her ears. He would sit by the fire in the evenings, humming tunelessly to the baby while Mary Lee finished her chores, his expression softer than Mary Lee had ever seen it, as if the child had unlocked something in him that had been closed off by years of hardship and self-reliance. It was during these quiet moments that Mary Lee felt most content, watching her husband and child by the flickering light, the rest of the world held at bay by the cabin walls. In these moments, the sacrifices seemed worthwhile, the hard work, the isolation, the distance from her family. They were building something together, something that was entirely their own, unencumbered by the past or by the expectations of others. They were creating not just a family, but a new way of being, defined by their own choices, rather than by the patterns established by previous generations. Their second daughter, Betty, arrived just 18 months after Maggie, conceived during the brief respite between weaning the first child and the resumption of Mary Lee's monthly courses. This pregnancy was harder, marked by persistent nausea that lasted well beyond the early months and by a bone-deep fatigue that made even the simplest tasks seem monumental. The delivery, too, was more prolonged, with the baby seemingly reluctant to leave the safety of the womb. But eventually Betty arrived, smaller than her sister had been, but with a lusty cry that suggested she would thrive despite her size. Soon the small cabin was filled with the sounds of two small children, Maggie's first words and tentative steps, Betty's infant coos and cries, the constant movement and noise that transformed the space from a dwelling to a home. Mary Lee managed them with the same quiet efficiency she had learned from her mother, establishing routines that allowed her to care for the children while maintaining the household. She nursed the baby while instructing Maggie in simple tasks suitable for her age, sorting beans, folding rags, carrying kindling in her small arms. She strapped Betty to her back with a shawl when she needed both hands free, the weight of the child a constant reminder of her responsibilities, a physical manifestation of the love that sustained her through exhaustion and occasional despair. Sometimes the weight of responsibility made her shoulders sag when she thought no one was looking. The relentless demands of two small children, combined with the never-ending work of rural life, sometimes left Mary Lee feeling as if she were drowning, gasping for air in the brief moments between one task and the next. There were days when she longed for her mother's presence, for the comfort of familiar hands helping with the workload, for the reassurance that this phase would pass, that the children would grow and become helpers rather than constant burdens. There were nights when she wept silently after Eli and the children were asleep, overcome by the enormity of what she had undertaken at such a young age, by the irreversible nature of the choices that had brought her to this point. Eli noticed, though. Despite his long hours away from home, despite his own exhaustion from physical labor that would have broken a lesser man, he saw the strain in his young wife's face, the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her hands sometimes trembled with fatigue as she served the evening meal. He began saving from each paycheck, setting aside coins in a tin box hidden beneath a floorboard near the hearth. When Mary Lee asked what he was saving for, he simply said, "Something to make things easier." He offered no further explanation, and Mary Lee didn't press. In a life where surprises were rarely pleasant, she had learned to take comfort in the predictable, to expect little and be grateful for small mercies. That something turned out to be a new cast-iron stove delivered by wagon from Somerset after months of careful saving. The stove was second-hand, but in good condition, a significant upgrade from the open fireplace where Mary Lee had previously done all the cooking. It had an oven for baking bread and 4 burners on top, allowing multiple dishes to be prepared simultaneously. Most importantly, it offered more control over cooking temperatures and used less wood than the fireplace, reducing the amount of time Eli needed to spend chopping and stacking fuel for the winter. Mary Lee cried when she saw it, the first time Eli had seen her shed tears since their wedding day. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of the overwhelming feeling of being seen and understood in her daily struggles. The stove transformed their lives in ways that might seem small to outsiders, but were monumental within their 4 walls. Cooking became less arduous, the cabin stayed warmer in winter, and there was a sense of pride in owning something so modern and substantial, something that set them apart from neighbors who still cooked over open fires as their ancestors had done for generations. But Eli wasn't finished. He continued saving, adding to the tin box whenever possible, taking extra work when it was available, foregoing small luxuries like tobacco so that the coins would accumulate faster. On their next trip to Somerset, to sell the fall apple harvest, a journey they made twice yearly to trade the fruit from the trees on the Gadbury property for goods they couldn't produce themselves, he took Mary Lee to the hardware store, where she had often lingered before the window display, admiring items that seemed beyond their reach. Inside was an iron bed frame, elegant in its simplicity, with ball accents and vertical rods forming the headboard and footboard. It wasn't the most elaborate model available, lacking the brass filigree and ornate scrollwork of the more expensive versions, but it represented a level of comfort and sophistication that Mary Lee had never expected to attain. It was an extravagance by their standards, But Eli had been putting aside money for months, prioritizing his wife's comfort over other improvements that might have seemed more practical. When he told the shopkeeper they would take it, Mary Lee squeezed his hand so tightly her knuckles went white. She couldn't speak, couldn't find words to express what this gesture meant to her. It wasn't just the bed itself, though that was valuable enough. It was the recognition of her worth, the acknowledgement that her comfort mattered, that she deserved beauty and ease in a life that offered little of either. It was Eli's way of saying that she was more than a cook and a mother and a helpmate. She was a woman whose happiness was worth sacrificing for, worth planning for, worth the considerable expense of an item that was, by the standards of their community, an unnecessary luxury. The bed was delivered 2 weeks later, hauled up the rutted track to their cabin on the same wagon that had brought the stove. It took the combined efforts of Eli and the wagon driver to maneuver it through the narrow cabin door and position it against the wall opposite the fireplace. The old rope bed where they had previously slept was dismantled and stored in the lean-to, possibly to be used for the children when they grew older, or perhaps to be traded to a neighbor in need. The new bed transformed their small cabin, becoming the focal point of the single room, a statement of permanence and prosperity in a world where both were precarious. No longer would they sleep on the rope bed Eli had constructed when they first married, with its sagging center and the constant need to tighten the ropes as they stretched with use. This was a proper bed, the kind Mary Lee had only seen in the homes of more prosperous families or in the pages of the mail-order catalogs that occasionally made their way to Casey County, passed from house to house until the pages were worn thin from handling. Mary Lee made new bedding for it, saving scraps of fabric for months to piece together a quilt worthy of such a fine frame. She worked on it during the long winter evenings after the children were asleep and the day's chores completed, stitching by the light of the fire and the single kerosene lamp they reserved for special tasks that required close attention. The quilt pattern she chose was called Wedding Ring, a series of interlocking circles that symbolized eternal connection, each piece carefully cut and sewn to create a design that was both beautiful and meaningful. At night, lying beside Eli on their new bed, Mary Lee felt a contentment she had never known before. The iron frame didn't creak with every movement, as the old rope bed had done. The mattress, stuffed with fresh straw and cotton batting, provided support without the lumps and hollows that had previously made comfortable sleep elusive. But beyond these physical comforts was the deeper satisfaction of achievement, of progress, of having built something together. Not just a home, but a life that was entirely their own. They had started with nothing but youth and determination, had weathered the challenges of early marriage and parenthood, had gradually improved their circumstances through hard work and careful planning. The bed was a tangible symbol of how far they had come, a promise of what might still be possible in the years ahead. Perhaps someday they would add another room to the cabin, giving the girls a space of their own as they grew. Perhaps they would be able to purchase more land, expanding beyond the small plot Eli's father-in-law had granted them. Perhaps they would even see their daughters educated beyond the basics that the local school provided, giving them opportunities that neither Mary Lee nor Eli had enjoyed in their own childhoods. As happy as Mary Lee was with her growing family and their improving circumstances, there was one desire that remained unfulfilled. She longed to give Eli a son. Not that he had ever expressed disappointment in their daughters. On the contrary, he doted on Maggie and Betty, bringing them little whittled toys and teaching them to recognize animal tracks in the woods. He braided their hair with surprising dexterity, told them stories of his own childhood, carried them on his shoulders when they grew tired during the walk to church. He was a better father than many men in the community, who viewed their daughters as little more than extra hands for household work until they could be married off to become someone else's responsibility. But Mary Lee knew the importance of sons in these hills, had absorbed this knowledge with her mother's milk, had heard it reinforced in 1,000 casual comments throughout her life. Sons carried on the family name. Sons worked alongside their fathers as they grew, eventually taking over the family trade or the family land. Sons provided for their parents in old age, offering security in a world without pensions or social safety nets. Sons were insurance against the precariousness of existence, against the uncertainty of survival in a place where illness or accident could transform prosperity to destitution in the space of a single season. Daughters who would marry and join other households could never fulfill this role, regardless of their affection or their willingness to help. Custom and necessity dictated that their primary obligations would be to their husbands and their husbands' families, not to the parents who had raised them. So when Mary Lee discovered she was expecting their third child in early 1899, she secretly hoped this would be the son Eli deserved. She had just turned 20, still young by modern standards, but already a seasoned wife and mother by the measures of her time and place. This pregnancy felt different from the previous two, though whether this was due to physical changes or to her own expectations, she couldn't have said. She carried the child differently this time, lower and more forward than with the girls, the weight distributed in a way that made her back ache constantly, but which the older women of the community assured her was a sign of a male child. The old women nodded knowingly when they saw her, their eyes assessing the shape of her belly, the way she walked, the color in her cheeks. Carrying like a boy, they would say, or "You're all out front this time," the comments delivered with the confidence of those who had observed generations of pregnancies and believed they could predict the outcome based on such observations. Mary Lee took heart in their unspoken confirmation, allowing herself to believe in the folk wisdom that had guided women's lives for centuries before modern medicine offered more reliable means of determination. She developed cravings for salty foods rather than the sweets she had desired during her previous pregnancies, another sign that was interpreted as indicating a male child. She found herself reaching for the salt cellar at every meal, adding extra to the beans and cornbread that formed the staples of their diet. She craved pickles and preserved meats, foods that had held little appeal during her earlier pregnancies, but which now seemed irresistible. These preferences, too, were noted by the community's women and added to the growing consensus that Mary Lee was carrying a son. Every sign pointed to a boy, and Mary Lee began to plan accordingly. She saved scraps of Eli's worn-out work shirts to make baby clothes, thinking how sweet it would be to see a miniature version of her husband. She imagined the child in Eli's image, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with the same quiet strength and gentle hands. She dreamed of watching father and son working side by side as the boy grew, Eli teaching him the skills that had ensured their survival and gradual prosperity, passing down not just practical knowledge, but the values that defined the man Mary Lee had come to love and respect over the years of their marriage. As her time drew near, Mary Lee spent long hours kneeling beside their bed, praying for a safe delivery and a healthy son. She had never been particularly religious. Church was more a social obligation than a spiritual practice in these parts, a time for seeing neighbors and exchanging news rather than for communion with the divine. But something about this pregnancy awakened a fervor in her, a desperate need to appeal to powers beyond her understanding or control. Perhaps it was intuition, a subconscious recognition of the danger ahead, a premonition of what was to come. Or perhaps it was simply the natural anxiety of a mother approaching her third birth in less than 4 years, aware of the risks that attended even the most straightforward of deliveries in an era before antibiotics or surgical interventions. She prayed fervently, sometimes for hours, her lips moving silently as she addressed a God she wasn't sure was listening, but whom she hoped might be swayed by the intensity of her devotion, if not by the elegance of her words. She prayed for a son, yes, but more fundamentally for survival, her own and the child's. She had attended enough births and funerals to know that the two events were sometimes separated by only hours, that the transition from expectant mother to cold corpse could occur with terrifying swiftness. She had seen women in the prime of life laid out in their best dresses, their faces composed in the artificial serenity of death, their newborns either lying beside them in shared stillness or left behind to be raised by grieving husbands or reluctant relatives. These fears she kept to herself, not wanting to worry Eli or to invite misfortune by speaking it aloud. Instead, she focused on the practical preparations for the birth, gathering clean rags for bedding, preparing a special soap for washing the infant, setting aside her best nightgown to wear during labor, arranging for a neighbor woman to mind Maggie and Betty when the time came. She followed all the traditional precautions meant to ensure a safe delivery, avoiding certain foods that were believed to make labor more difficult, tying a red string around her wrist to ward off evil influences, placing a knife under the bed to cut the pain when labor began. She knew these practices were rooted more in superstition than in medical knowledge, but she observed them anyway, unwilling to tempt fate by neglecting any measure that might increase her chances of survival. The day Mary Lee went into labor was unseasonably warm for early spring, with a hint of summer in the air that made the cabin stuffy despite the open door. The windows of the cabin stood open, allowing a gentle breeze to stir the curtains as the first pains began, mild contractions that Mary Lee initially mistook for the backache that had plagued her throughout this pregnancy. She went about her morning tasks as usual, feeding the chickens, preparing breakfast for the family, sweeping the packed earth floor of the cabin. Only when the pains began to come at regular intervals, increasing in intensity with each occurrence, did she acknowledge to herself that labor had begun. Eli sent word to the granny woman from Henson Creek, an elderly midwife who had delivered most of the children in the county, including Mary Lee herself some 20 years earlier. The woman was known for her skill and her discretion, qualities that made her services sought after despite her advancing age and the difficulty of traversing the rough terrain between homesteads. By the time she arrived, making her way slowly up the path to the cabin with the aid of a gnarled walking stick, Mary Lee's labor was well established, her face already showing signs of strain as she paced the small confines of the cabin, pausing to brace herself against the table or the wall when contractions seized her. The granny woman assessed the situation with experienced eyes, noting Mary Lee's condition, the frequency and duration of the contractions, the position of the child as determined by external palpation. She shooed Eli outside where he paced the yard like a caged animal, occasionally stopping to reassure Maggie and Betty, who played nearby, unaware of the gravity of what was happening inside. The girls had been told that the granny woman was helping their mother bring a new baby, but they had no concept of the danger involved, no understanding of why their father's face was drawn with worry, or why their usual routines had been disrupted. Inside, the granny woman prepared the bed for delivery, covering the precious quilt with old sheets that could be discarded afterward, positioning Mary Lee to maximize the efficiency of her pushing when the time came. She administered herbal teas meant to strengthen contractions and ease pain, concoctions of blue cohosh and raspberry leaf, and other plants whose properties had been known to women healers for generations, before their active ingredients were isolated and synthesized by modern pharmacology. Hours passed, and the labor showed no signs of progressing normally. Mary Lee's contractions were strong but irregularly spaced, suggesting that the child was not positioned correctly for birth. Her cries became more desperate, the pauses between them shorter, her strength visibly failing as the day wore on, with no sign of imminent delivery. The granny woman's expression grew increasingly concerned as she checked Mary Lee's progress, finding that despite hours of labor, the child had not descended into the birth canal as expected. When Eli could stand it no longer and burst back into the cabin, defying the tradition that men should remain outside during childbirth, he found Mary Lee pale and sweating, her hair plastered to her forehead as she struggled to push. The granny woman's face was grim as she worked between Mary Lee's legs, muttering instructions that Mary Lee seemed too far gone to follow. The air in the cabin was thick with the metallic scent of blood, with the sour smell of sweat, and fear, with the tension of impending tragedy. As dusk fell, the crisis reached its peak. The granny woman, recognizing that conventional methods were failing, resorted to more desperate measures, physically attempting to turn the child within the womb, applying pressure to Mary Lee's abdomen in an effort to force the baby into the correct position for birth. These manipulations, performed without anesthesia or antiseptic precautions, caused Mary Lee agonies beyond description, her screams echoing through the cabin and across the surrounding hills, reaching the ears of neighbors who crossed themselves and whispered prayers for mother and child. With one final, terrible effort, Mary Lee pushed her son into the world. A perfect, silent boy who never drew breath, his umbilical cord wrapped tightly around his neck, cutting off his oxygen supply long before he could make the transition from womb to world. In the same moment that the granny woman cut the umbilical cord, Mary Lee gave a shuddering gasp and then fell still, her eyes fixed on some distant point that no living person could see. A hemorrhage, uncontrollable with the limited means available, had taken her life even as she fulfilled her deepest wish, to give Eli a son. The granny woman tried everything she knew to revive both mother and child, working frantically to stem the flow of blood, to force air into the infant's lungs. But it was too late. In the space of a heartbeat, Eli had lost both his wife and his son. The aftermath passed in a blur for Eli. Neighbors came to prepare Mary Lee's body, washing away the blood and dressing her in her Sunday best, the blue calico dress she had worn on special occasions, her hair arranged in loose waves around her face, her hands folded over her chest in eternal repose. Someone took the stillborn boy, wrapped him in a small piece of the quilt Mary Lee had made for their marriage bed, and placed him in his mother's arms. The tiny bundle looked impossibly small against Mary Lee's body, a potent symbol of unfulfilled promise, of futures that would never unfold, of dreams that had died before they could take root in reality. They were buried together the next day, beneath the oak trees in the church cemetery, their graves marked by a simple stone that Eli had dragged from the creek bed, a labor of love and grief that left his hands raw and bleeding, but which provided the only outlet for emotions too vast to be contained within his body. The inscription, carved by Eli's own hand with tools borrowed from a neighbor, read only, "Mary Lee Murphy and Son, 1899. No flowery epitaph, no biblical quotation, no elaborate description of virtues or relationships, just names and a date, the stark simplicity of the marker reflecting the essential nature of the loss, a life cut short, a future erased, a family fractured beyond repair. The funeral was attended by most of the community, more out of respect for the customs of death than from any particular closeness to the Murphy family. Women brought food, the traditional offerings of comfort in times of sorrow, practical assistance for a man suddenly left alone with two small children and no idea how to feed them. Men offered awkward condolences and promises of help with spring planting, with roof repairs, with the 1,000 tasks that kept a homestead functioning. Children stood silent and wide-eyed, sensing the gravity of the occasion without fully comprehending it, instructed to behave with unusual decorum in the presence of death. After the burial, after the neighbors had departed, after the girls had been taken to stay with their grandparents for the night, Eli returned to the cabin alone. The emptiness of the space struck him with physical force, as if the air itself had become solid, pressing against his chest until he struggled to breathe. The cabin was exactly as they had left it the day before. Mary Lee's shawl hanging by the door, her sewing basket beside the rocking chair, a half-finished shirt for Maggie laid out on the table. But the animating presence that had transformed these objects from mere possessions into extensions of a beloved person was gone, leaving behind only the hollow shell of what had once been a home. Eli returned to the bed that still bore the indentation of Mary Lee's body and the stains of her final struggle. The sheets had been changed, the evidence of tragedy removed by the same neighbor women who had prepared Mary Lee's body for burial, but the mattress beneath still held the memory of what had occurred there. He sat on the edge of the bed he had saved so carefully to buy for her, the bed that had been the site of their most intimate moments and of Mary Lee's last breath, and something broke inside him. The sound that came from his throat wasn't human, a keening wail that echoed through the empty cabin and across the dark hills beyond, a primal expression of grief that transcended language, that connected him to every person who had ever loved and lost since the beginning of human consciousness. He rocked back and forth, arms wrapped around his middle, as if physically holding himself together, tears streaming unchecked down his face and into his beard. He had not wept at the funeral, had maintained the stoic demeanor expected of men in his community, had accepted condolences with nods and murmured thanks. But here, alone in the darkness, he gave himself permission to feel the full weight of his loss, to acknowledge the devastation that had overtaken his life in the space of a single day. In the days that followed, Eli moved through his duties like a man underwater, feeding the livestock, chopping wood, fetching his daughters back from their grandparents after the initial shock had passed. The girls were confused and frightened, too young to fully understand the permanence of death, but old enough to sense that something fundamental had changed in their world. Maggie at 5 asked repeatedly when Mama was coming home, unable to grasp that the still figure in the church cemetery was the same person who had kissed her goodnight just days before. Betty, barely 3, cried for her mother at bedtime, refusing to be consoled by Eli's awkward attempts at comfort, eventually crying herself to sleep with a lock of Mary Lee's hair clutched in her small fist, a tangible connection to the mother she would soon forget. Eli answered their questions about their mother with gentle half-truths. "She's gone to heaven, she's watching over us from the stars. She loved you very much and didn't want to leave." What he couldn't bring himself to say was that she died trying to give them a brother, that her last act had been one of incredible pain and ultimate sacrifice. He couldn't tell them that their own existence might have contributed to Mary Lee's death, that each pregnancy had weakened her, that her body, still young, but already taxed by 2 previous births in quick succession, had simply been unable to withstand the demands of a 3rd delivery. These were truths too complex, too painful for children to bear, truths that Eli himself struggled to accept in the dark hours of the night, when sleep eluded him and regret was his only companion. The months after Mary Lee's death were a study in quiet desperation. Eli continued working at the lumber camp, leaving the girls with neighbors during the day. He had no choice. The family needed his income to survive, and there was no one else to provide it. At night he tried to recreate the routines Mary Lee had established, simple meals, baths by the fire, bedtime stories told in his rough, halting voice. But there were 1,000 small tasks he had never noticed Mary Lee performing until they went undone. Buttons that needed sewing, hair that needed braiding, scrapes that needed tending, with a mother's touch rather than a father's awkward ministrations. He did his best, learning through trial and error, accepting help when it was offered without the pride that might have made him refuse before tragedy had humbled him. He learned to cook basic meals that would keep the girls fed, if not particularly well-nourished. He learned to mend clothing well enough to extend its useful life, if not with the neat stitches Mary Lee would have produced. He learned to arrange Maggie's hair in simple plaits, to wash Betty's face without soap getting in her eyes, to clean the cabin just enough to prevent illness, if not to achieve the standard of orderliness that Mary Lee had maintained. Most difficult of all were the nights. Eli couldn't bring himself to sleep in the bed where Mary Lee had died. Instead, he made a pallet on the floor, leaving the fine iron bed untouched, exactly as it had been on that last day. The bed became a sort of shrine, a place where Eli sometimes sat, when the girls were asleep, running his hands over the quilt Mary Lee had made, allowing himself to remember her as she had been in life, rather than as she had been at the end. Sometimes he talked to her in these moments, sharing the events of the day, asking for guidance he knew would never come, finding comfort in the ritual of connection, even if the connection itself was an illusion. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, he thought he could hear Mary Lee moving around the cabin, the soft pad of her bare feet across the wooden floors, the rustle of her skirts, the gentle humming she had always done while working. Once he even thought he heard an infant's cry, so faint it might have been the wind through the chinking, a sound that filled him with both longing and dread. These moments left him shaking and sleepless, wondering if grief had finally driven him to madness, if the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was more permeable than he had been raised to believe. By 1902, Eli knew he couldn't continue this way. The girls were growing. Maggie nearly 8, Betty just past 6, and they needed more than he alone could provide. They needed a mother's guidance, a woman's perspective, a stability that Eli, still haunted by Mary Lee's absence, could not offer them. The cabin that had once been a haven had become a prison of memories, each corner holding echoes of happier times, each object a reminder of what had been lost. Casey County held too many ghosts, too many reminders, too many people who looked at Eli and his daughters with the uncomfortable mixture of pity and relief that accompanies others' tragedies, gratitude that misfortune has struck elsewhere, unease at the recognition that no one is immune to fate's cruel whims. After much deliberation, he decided to make a fresh start in Illinois, where a cousin had written of good work opportunities in the growing industrial centers of the state. It was a radical decision to leave the mountains that had been his home for his entire life, to take his children away from the only environment they had known, to venture into a world that operated by different rules and valued different skills than those he had developed over years of rural existence. But the alternative, to remain in the shadow of loss, to watch his daughters grow up in a community that would always see them as objects of pity, to continue living half a life while longing for what could never be restored, seemed unbearable. He sold most of their possessions, converting physical objects into the cash that would be needed for the journey and for establishing themselves in their new location. The sale was painful but necessary, each item representing a memory, a connection to the life they were leaving behind. He sold the rocking chair where Mary Lee had nursed the girls, the table where they had shared meals as a family, the trunk that had been part of Mary Lee's dowry when they married. But he couldn't bring himself to part with the stove Mary Lee had loved or the bed where she had drawn her last breath. These he left behind in the cabin, unable to take them, but equally unable to see them pass to other hands, to be used by people who had no understanding of their significance, no reverence for the history embedded in their metal frames. The Wesley family who bought the farm were young and eager, with no knowledge of the tragedy that had unfolded within those cabin walls. Orville and Victoria Wesley were newlyweds, full of plans for expanding the cabin and making the farm profitable again after its years of neglect under Eli's distracted stewardship. They saw the property not as a site of loss, but as a blank canvas for their own aspirations, their own future. They kept the stove in place, recognizing its practical value, but moved the iron bed frame to storage in their new barn, finding it impractical for their needs, too large for the small sleeping area, too ornate for their simple tastes, perhaps carrying an energy they subconsciously sensed but couldn't identify. And there it remained, gathering dust and cobwebs, as the Wesleys built their life around it, unaware of its history, unaware of the love and loss it had witnessed, unaware of the connections that transcended physical possession and extended across time in ways that defied rational explanation. The bed waited, patient as only inanimate objects can be, for the next chapter in its story, for the next lives it would touch, for the next witnesses to the truth that some bonds cannot be broken by death or distance or the relentless passage of years.